Hi, this is Misha, and we just were out shooting this gun here. This is the French M.A.B. PA.15, chambered for 9mm Luger, Parabellum, 9x19, the standard kind of cartridge after World War II. Really just wanted to go out and shoot it. It's an interesting gun, mechanically and historically so. This was never officially adopted by the French, although French Special Forces did acquire a few. And Finland purchased, Finland Border Security would purchase a few thousand. So it saw limited military use, and it saw some police use. This gun is a transitional gun, kind of between the old style of gun and the newer styles of the 80s, the so-called Wonder 9s. And I brought out on the table a couple of other guns of French origin. This is the French Savage in 7.65. And this is a more modern high power, FN high power. This is a Mark II, but it'll do for today's demonstration purposes. Kind of really shows the gun. So the M.A.B. company manufactured arms, the Bayonne. Really became famous in the 1930s for producing copies of the Ruby, the Colt 1903, the FN 1910, 1922. They were in 32, 7.65, 9mm short, 380. They would do the Model C, the Model D. They would do the A and B and 25. They would do quite a few. They would even get some military contracts and police contracts in the late 30s, and they would be occupied during the war by the Nazis, and they would continue to produce some guns under Nazi occupation. After the war, they started to work on a new design in the 50s, which they released in 1966, and it went into production a short time later. That is the PA.15. This gun has a few unique features and a few very traditional features, which is almost something I can say for every French gun. It seems like they would go ultra-modern in some areas and very conservative in others. So ultra-modern. I'll pull the mag out here. First off, they used a rotating barrel, which isn't a true locked breech. But the way it works, as the bullet's going through the barrel, the torque is the opposite direction of how it wants to rotate, so it keeps it closed long enough to get the bullet out and let pressures drop, and then it recoils back and cycles the action. Now, M.A.B. went with this because they felt it would give them the most ammo compatibility. That way the gun's not ammo sensitive. It can fire pretty much anything. The design is pretty much copied from this gun here. The Savage 1907 also has a rotating barrel. Now this is only in 32, 7.65, but it does have a rotating barrel. France would purchase a good number of these during World War I. I think it was about 30,000 total, and they would use it. So they had experience with the rotating barrel design in the earlier days. So it doesn't surprise me that's where M.A.B. got the idea from. Another very modern design, the 15 in PA.15 stands for 15 round capacity. This uses a double stack 15 shot mag here. It's very similar to a Smith & Wesson type mag. This gun was the first gun to come onto the market and go into production that had the most capacity. It was the first 15 shot gun. Before it, the high power had the highest capacity at 13. Very similar magazine structure, as you can see, just a little bit larger here. And even going back to the Savage, which was a much earlier gun, we have really one of the first commercially available double stack mags. This one holds 10 rounds. but it is double. If it had been a single stack, we would get maybe 8 in here. So they definitely took inspiration from the Savage, I would think. And since M.A.B. was known for copying other designs, not really surprising. Interestingly, the high power was originally designed by FN in the early 30s for French military trials. Now, ultimately, the SAC M1935A was adopted, and later the MAC 1935S, it was a substitute standard. Now, functionally, this is not really much like the M.A.B. It uses a Browning-style barrel. Yudenevstev at FN was a partner of Browning's, and Browning worked on this gun before his death in 1926, and Sèvres continued afterwards. It is a single action only with magazine disconnect safety, as you see here. We have a Browning-style thumb safety. Single action. So that is similar. Looking at the PA.15, we also have a magazine disconnect safety, which is a very common French trait, and a Browning style safety here as well. So even though it uses kind of the Savage style barrel, a lot of the cues were taken from the high power. But we are still the highest capacity gun of its era. And M.A.B. really was trying for military contracts with this. Now, those were kind of the modern features. The traditional features would be this single action-only hammer. Good trigger, but no double action. And by the late 60s, double action was becoming a standard. That was originally introduced with the Walther P38. M.A.B. did experiment with a double action lock work for this gun, but it never went into production. Also, just the way this gun is made. Very, very few, I think there's only 2, maybe 3 stamped metal parts are in it. This is mostly machined steel. Even the base plate, you see how thick it is machined steel on the magazine. So production costs, French labor costs were not exactly cheap in the 60s and 70s. So production cost was quite high. This is quite a large and very heavy gun. That said, even though it has a very wide grip at the bottom, it kind of tapers at the top and gives you a high purchase. So it is a very comfortable grip even though it's wide. And I have pretty small hands, and even I find it still quite comfortable. Now, they would make a few production changes in the 70s. They would go from a high polished blued finish to parkerized. This is kind of a transitional gun. It has the kind of the rougher parkerized frame, but the slide is still more polished blued. I think it still might be a parked slide, but it's a very polished parked. So it's a transitional gun in a way. They would go from this machined base plate to a stamped one, so they would cheapen the magazine up a little bit. And they would change the name from PA.15 late in production to just P.15. Just a change. They would build about 100,000 of these total, so not an insignificant number. For a commercial gun, it's quite a large number. And as I said, a few thousand went to different military users. Quite a few were also exported over here to the U.S., where the gun was modestly popular. When they were sent over, though, they came in a very nice box with a very nice certificate engraving on it. But one thing they didn't really come with usually was a spare mag. There was usually just one mag in the box, especially later in production. Now, the French military would adopt a version of this called the F1 for competition shooting, but it was not a combat gun. And they would do several different versions, adjustable sights and fixed sights and different as well. So they would do a few. Production ended around 1980. And by 1982, manufactured arms to Bayonne, M.A.B. itself, would start to go out of business. After it went out of business, the remainder of M.A.B. P.15 parts would be sold off to another French company, a small manufacturer in France. And they would continue to build these guns from mostly leftover parts through the 90s and even into the 2000s. But as far as original MAB manufacture, it ended in 1980, with small batches being made up till today. It's kind of a similar story to the Maneurin MR73 pistol, actually. Yeah, we were just out shooting it. The rotating barrel makes it a very interesting gun to shoot. I can't really describe the recoil adequately. It was a good gun, but it was heavy. They did try to get France's military to adopt it. At the time, they were using the Model 1950, which was a single stack, 8-shot, single action pistol. They looked at this, but since it was still a single action gun, the only real advantage was the double stack, and that came at the cost of weight. They decided, probably correctly so, that it really wasn't worth upgrading just for that. I think if it had been double action, it might have received a better response, and also if it hadn't had an alloy frame. This is a steel frame. As you know, by the 70s, alloy frames were becoming quite popular. Walther used them with their P1s, which went into the P5 and into the P88. SIG came out with the alloy frame with the 220, the P220, which led to the 226. And probably most famously, Beretta released the Model 92, which turned into the 92 FS in the M9 pistol. Also, you have companies like Smith & Wesson who do a whole plethora of guns with alloy frames. Heck, even Colt was making 1911s with alloy frames. So alloy frame double action was kind of the wave of the future in the 70s and was really very popular by the 80s. MAB just didn't get there, and again, as a company, they were having some financial trouble too. So, released in 1966, out of production by 1980, at least standard production. But nevertheless, an interesting gun, and kind of what might have been in French military service. One thing I will say about the rotating barrel system, it does have a very stout recoil spring, so retracting the slide requires a decent amount of force. Luckily, these grooves are pretty deep and have very defined edges. Serrations are quite good. For a gun with a magazine disconnect, the trigger is perfectly fine. Yeah, just an interesting gun. Thought we'd talk about it today. If you want to share your own PA.15s or P.15s below, we'd love to hear about yours. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to also post those. If you like the video, please click like. If you have time to subscribe, we'd really appreciate that too. And we have a good number of other videos on French firearms, so if you haven't seen those yet, you might find those interesting as well. As always, this is Misha. Really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.